Every Sunday afternoon, when the church bells ring, Atlas runs to the same wooden bench and waits. But nobody knows who he is waiting for. The small town of Willow Creek has heard the church bells for generations. The sound travels gently across the streets, passing old houses, quiet gardens, and the peaceful path beside the little white church at the center of town. For most people, it is simply a familiar sound, a reminder that another week has passed. But for Caleb Rowe, those bells have become a mystery. Because every time they ring, Atlas moves. The German shepherd lifts his head, looks toward the church, and walks with a purpose that Caleb cannot explain. He does not run after birds. He does not chase anything. He simply heads toward one place. An old wooden bench beneath a large oak tree. The first few times it happened, Caleb thought it was just a habit. Dogs notice patterns. Dogs enjoy familiar places. That was normal. But Atlas did the same thing every single time. The moment the bells echoed through town, the German shepherd would leave whatever he was doing and quietly wait beside that bench. Caleb had lived with Atlas long enough to understand him. The dog was curious, but he was not careless. Atlas paid attention to things most people missed. A change in someone's voice, a familiar scent carried by the wind, a feeling that something important was nearby. One Sunday afternoon, Caleb decided to follow him. The air was cool, and golden sunlight covered the quiet streets. The sound of the bells filled the sky, slow and peaceful. Atlas walked beside Caleb until they reached the wooden bench. Then he stopped. He sat down and looked toward the empty path ahead. Not searching, not wandering, waiting. Caleb stood beside him, feeling something he could not describe. "Who are you waiting for, buddy?" he whispered. Atlas only looked forward. The bench was old. The paint had faded. The wood showed years of rain, sunshine, and seasons passing by. It looked like any other forgotten seat in a small town. But Atlas treated it like it mattered. Caleb sat down beside him and looked around. Nothing seemed unusual. There was only the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the distant echo of the church bells fading away. Yet the silence felt meaningful, like a story was hiding beneath the surface. Over the following weeks, Caleb started paying closer attention. He noticed small details. Atlas always sat on the same side of the bench. He always arrived within moments of the bells ringing. And he always looked toward the same path, as if expecting someone to appear. Caleb began wondering if Atlas remembered something from before. Something connected to the church. Something connected to that bench. Something that had been forgotten by everyone except him. The mystery was no longer about a dog's strange routine. It was about a promise that seemed to have survived time. And every Sunday, when the bells rang again, Atlas returned to the wooden bench, quietly waiting for the moment when the past might finally come home. The mystery of the wooden bench stayed with Caleb Rowe long after the church bells stopped ringing. Each Sunday afternoon, the same quiet moment repeated itself. The bells echoed across Willow Creek. Atlas lifted his head, and the German shepherd walked toward the old oak tree without hesitation. Caleb had seen many things during his years with Atlas, but this felt different. It was not excitement. It was not curiosity. It was something deeper. Atlas was remembering something. The question was, what? During the week, Caleb watched Atlas more carefully. He noticed how the dog carried himself around the small town. Atlas greeted neighbors with gentle patience, walked calmly beside Caleb, and seemed to notice every little change around him. But when they passed near the church, Atlas always slowed down. His eyes moved toward the wooden bench. It was as if the place held a quiet message only he could understand. Caleb decided to learn more about the bench. One morning, he visited the church and spoke with the caretaker, an older man named Thomas who had looked after the building for many years. Thomas listened as Caleb explained Atlas's unusual routine. At first, he smiled. Then his expression became thoughtful. "That bench has been there longer than most people remember," Thomas said. He explained that generations of families had sat there after Sunday services. People rested beneath the oak tree, shared conversations, and enjoyed peaceful afternoons together. But when Caleb asked if anyone special had a connection to the bench, Thomas paused. He looked out the window toward the old wooden seat. "There was someone," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Caleb listened carefully. Thomas explained that many years earlier, a person used to sit there every Sunday after the bells rang. They came alone, but never seemed lonely. They always looked toward the same path, almost as if they were waiting for someone. Caleb felt a strange connection between those words and Atlas's behavior. The same bench, the same waiting, the same quiet hope. Before leaving, Thomas showed Caleb an old collection of photographs from the church archives. Most were simple pictures of community events, family gatherings, and celebrations. But one photograph caught Caleb's attention. It showed the wooden bench beneath the oak tree, much younger and brighter than it looked today. Standing nearby was a person with a dog. The image was faded, but the bond between them was clear. Caleb looked at Atlas, who was sitting patiently beside him. The German shepherd seemed interested in the photograph, almost as if the image carried a familiar feeling. Caleb did not have answers yet. He did not know who the person was or why Atlas always returned to that bench. But he knew one thing. This was not just a habit. There was a story connected to that place. A story hidden beneath years of silence. That afternoon, when the church bells rang again, Caleb followed Atlas back to the wooden bench. This time, he sat beside him and waited too. Because sometimes the first step toward understanding a mystery is simply being willing to stay long enough for the truth to find you. The old photograph from the church archive stayed in Caleb Rowe's thoughts for days. There was something about the image that felt familiar, even though he had never seen the person standing beside the wooden bench before. The faded picture showed a quiet moment from another time, but the connection between the person and the dog beside them was impossible to miss. It reminded Caleb of Atlas. Not because the German shepherd was the same dog, but because the feeling was the same, a bond that did not need words. The following Sunday, Caleb arrived at the church earlier than usual. He wanted to see if anything else could be discovered before the bells rang. Atlas walked beside him through the peaceful streets of Willow Creek, his steps calm and steady. When they reached the church, Thomas was already there. The caretaker welcomed them and brought out more old records from the small archive room. The room smelled of old paper and wooden shelves, carrying the quiet feeling of memories preserved over many years. Thomas searched through several boxes until he found a small notebook. The pages were worn, but the handwriting inside was still clear. He explained that the notebook belonged to someone who had spent many years near the church. Caleb carefully looked through the pages while Atlas rested nearby. Most entries described simple moments. Sunday afternoons. Conversations beneath the oak tree. The sound of church bells filling the town. But one entry caught Caleb's attention. It mentioned the wooden bench and a promise to return there every week. Caleb looked at Thomas. "Who wrote this?" he asked. Thomas took a slow breath. He explained that the writer was a man named Samuel, a longtime member of the community who had a deep connection with the church. Samuel was known for sitting on the bench after the bells rang, always looking toward the same path. People in town remembered him as someone who valued loyalty and quiet companionship. But over time, fewer people knew the reason behind his tradition. The story had slowly faded as years passed. Caleb felt a connection forming between the notebook, the photograph, and Atlas's unusual behavior. The German shepherd was not simply attracted to the bench. Something about that place carried a meaning that had survived through time. When the church bells finally rang that afternoon, Atlas stood immediately. He walked toward the wooden bench as he always did. Caleb followed closely behind. This time, he noticed something he had never seen before. Near the edge of the bench, beneath layers of old paint, there was a small carving in the wood. It was almost hidden, but still visible. A simple mark, a reminder left behind by someone who once sat there. Caleb gently brushed away the dust and looked closer. The carving was not a name. It was a small symbol that matched one found in the old notebook. His curiosity grew stronger. There was a reason Atlas kept returning. There was a reason the bells seemed to call him there. Caleb sat beside Atlas beneath the oak tree and watched the church doors close in the distance. The mystery was no longer just about a dog and a bench. It was about a connection between the past and the present. And somewhere inside that forgotten story was the answer to why Atlas continued to wait. The small symbol carved into the wooden bench stayed in Caleb Rowe's mind long after he returned home that evening. It was a detail so easy to miss, hidden beneath years of weather and changing seasons. Yet Atlas had led him directly to it. The German shepherd had never touched the bench or tried to disturb anything. He had simply waited, as if he knew Caleb needed to see what was there. The next morning, Caleb returned to the church with a notebook in his hand and Atlas walking quietly beside him. He wanted to understand the connection between Samuel, the old bench, and the mysterious symbol. Thomas welcomed them back, and continued searching through the church archives. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning. After several minutes, Thomas found an older collection of community records. Inside were notes about people who had been part of Willow Creek many years earlier. One name appeared several times: Samuel Carter. Thomas explained that Samuel had been someone who believed in keeping promises, even small ones. Every Sunday after the church bells rang, Samuel would sit on the wooden bench beneath the oak tree. He would stay there for a while, watching the path in front of him. Many people wondered what he was waiting for, but Samuel never shared the full story. Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog was lying peacefully on the floor, listening in his own quiet way. Thomas continued searching until he found an old newspaper clipping carefully placed between the pages of a record book. The article mentioned Samuel and his longtime companion, a German shepherd who had been part of his daily life. Caleb felt a quiet surprise. The connection between the bench and the dog was becoming clearer. Thomas explained that Samuel's dog had always waited beside him after the church bells. The two were often seen together near the oak tree. Their friendship had become a familiar sight in the community. But after many years, the story slowly disappeared from people's memories. Caleb looked down at Atlas, realizing why the dog seemed drawn to the bench. It was not simply a location. It carried the feeling of loyalty, companionship, and a promise that had once been shared there. Later that afternoon, Caleb and Atlas returned to the bench. The sunlight passed through the branches above them, creating soft patterns on the old wooden seat. Caleb noticed another small detail near the carving. A faded mark in the wood showed that someone had once placed a hand there many times. It was a place touched by years of waiting. Atlas sat beside him, looking toward the same path Samuel once watched. Caleb felt a sense of peace. He still did not know the entire story. He did not know who Samuel was waiting for or why the tradition continued through time. But he understood something important. Atlas was not following a random habit. He was connected to a memory that had survived quietly. That evening, as the church bells rang again, Caleb listened differently. The sound was no longer just a reminder of Sunday. It was a signal, a reminder that some bonds are strong enough to remain, even when the people who created them are no longer there. And Atlas, with his quiet patience, was showing Caleb that some stories are not lost. They are simply waiting for someone to listen. The connection between Atlas and the old wooden bench became the only question Caleb Rowe could think about. Every new discovery brought another piece of the story into view, yet the most important part still remained hidden. Who was Samuel truly waiting for? And why had the memory of that moment survived through so many years? Caleb returned to the church archives with Atlas beside him, hoping to find something that could complete the missing pieces. Thomas continued searching through old records, carefully turning each page as if every word carried a fragile memory. The afternoon light entered through the small windows of the archive room, creating a peaceful silence around them. After several minutes, Thomas found an envelope tucked inside an old community journal. The paper was worn, but the handwriting on the front was still clear. It was addressed to Samuel. Caleb felt a quiet surprise. This was not just another record. It was a personal message that had remained untouched for years. Thomas carefully opened it and began reading. The letter was written by someone who knew Samuel well. It described the special bond between Samuel and his German shepherd. The writer explained that the dog was more than a companion. He was a reminder of loyalty, patience, and hope during difficult seasons of life. The letter mentioned the wooden bench beneath the oak tree and the Sunday tradition that everyone in town recognized. Samuel would sit there after the church bells, waiting for someone who had promised to return. Caleb listened carefully. The story was becoming clearer, but one question remained. Who was the person Samuel was waiting for? Thomas searched through another box and found an old photograph hidden between several papers. The picture showed Samuel sitting on the same wooden bench, with his German shepherd beside him. But there was something else in the photograph. A second person was standing in the distance, walking toward the bench. The image was faded, but the moment captured something important. It was not a picture of someone leaving. It was a picture of someone coming home. Caleb looked at Atlas. The German shepherd was watching the photograph quietly, his ears slightly raised. It felt as if the dog understood the importance of the discovery. That evening, Caleb and Atlas returned to the wooden bench before the church bells rang. The town was peaceful. The trees moved gently in the wind, and the old church stood quietly in the background. Caleb sat down and looked at the path ahead. For the first time, he understood that the bench was never a place of sadness. It was a place of hope, a place where someone believed a promise was still alive. When the bells finally rang, Atlas stood beside the bench and looked down the path. Caleb watched him carefully. There was no sadness in the dog's eyes. Only patience. Only trust. Caleb realized that Atlas had not been searching for an answer. He had been protecting a memory of loyalty that had lasted beyond time. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Willow Creek, someone still carried the missing piece of Samuel's story. The mystery was not finished yet. But now Caleb knew they were closer than ever to finding the person who had once made a promise beneath the sound of church bells. The mystery surrounding the wooden bench had become a quiet part of Caleb Rowe's life. Every Sunday, when the church bells echoed across Willow Creek, Caleb and Atlas returned to the same place. But now, the old bench no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a message waiting to be understood. The photograph, the letter, and the faded records had all pointed to one missing person. Someone who had promised to return. Someone who had once been part of Samuel's life. Caleb knew the next step was finding that person. With Thomas's help, he searched through more community records. They looked through old directories, handwritten notes, and memories preserved by people who had lived in Willow Creek for decades. The search was slow, but every small detail brought them closer. One afternoon, Thomas found a note with an address written in the corner of an old page. The address belonged to a small town several hours away. The name connected to it was Clara. Thomas explained that Clara had been one of Samuel's closest friends many years ago. She was the person who had written the letter. She was also the person walking toward the bench in the old photograph. Caleb felt a quiet sense of hope. They had finally found the missing piece. The following morning, Caleb and Atlas began their journey. The drive took them through peaceful countryside roads, past fields, small towns, and places where life moved at a slower pace. Atlas rested calmly in the passenger seat, watching the world pass by through the window. When they arrived at the address, Caleb saw a small cottage surrounded by flowers and tall trees. The place felt peaceful, almost like a home where memories had been carefully protected. Caleb knocked on the door. After a few moments, an elderly woman opened it. Her eyes moved from Caleb to Atlas, then stopped on the photograph he carried. She became quiet. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly. Caleb explained the story. He told her about the church bells, the wooden bench, and how Atlas returned every Sunday to the same place. The woman listened carefully. Then she smiled with a mixture of surprise and emotion. She introduced herself as Clara. She explained that Samuel had been her dearest friend. They had shared many years of friendship, and the wooden bench had always been a special place for them. Clara revealed that Samuel's German Shepherd had been the reason she remembered that promise for so long. The dog had always waited beside Samuel, just as Atlas waited today. Caleb looked at Atlas, feeling the connection become clearer. Clara explained that after Samuel passed into a new chapter of life, circumstances separated many people from Willow Creek. The traditions slowly faded, but one promise remained. Clara had always hoped to return to that bench one more time. The church bells, the bench, and the waiting had all been connected by a bond of loyalty that time could not erase. Before Caleb and Atlas left, Clara gently touched the old photograph and smiled. "Some friendships are quiet," she said, "but they never disappear." On the way home, Caleb looked at Atlas and realized the German Shepherd had been carrying a story far greater than he ever imagined. The mystery was no longer about why Atlas waited. Now, it was about honoring the promise that had brought everyone back together. The journey back to Willow Creek felt different for Caleb Rowe. The road was the same. The fields passed by the same windows, and the quiet towns along the way carried the same peaceful rhythm. But Caleb was no longer searching for answers. He was carrying a story that had finally found its missing pages. Atlas rested calmly beside him, the German Shepherd watching the world outside, as if he understood that something important had changed. When they arrived at the church, the afternoon light covered the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Yet Caleb knew the bench was no longer just a place where a dog waited. It was a place where a promise had survived. Thomas was waiting near the church entrance when they returned. Caleb shared everything he learned from Clara. The old photograph, the letter, the connection between Samuel and his loyal companion. Thomas listened quietly, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. He had spent many years wondering about the story behind the bench. Now he finally understood why Atlas was always drawn there. The following Sunday, something special happened in Willow Creek. Caleb, Thomas, and several people from the community gathered near the wooden bench after the church bells rang. Clara had traveled back to town as well. She stood beneath the oak tree, looking at the place where so many memories had remained hidden. When she saw the bench again, she became quiet. It was not sadness. It was the feeling of seeing an old friend after many years apart. Atlas walked slowly toward the bench and sat down beside it. Clara looked at the German shepherd and smiled. "He reminds me of him," she whispered. Caleb understood. The connection was not about the past repeating itself. It was about the kindness and loyalty that continued through time. Clara shared stories about Samuel that few people in Willow Creek had heard. She described his gentle nature, his love for simple moments, and the special bond he shared with his dog. The community listened closely. Many people had walked past that bench for years without knowing the story it carried. Now, they saw it differently. They saw a place filled with friendship, patience, and hope. Caleb watched Atlas lying peacefully beside the bench. The German shepherd had never needed recognition. He had never searched for attention. He had simply followed a feeling that something meaningful was waiting there. That evening, as the sun began to set, Caleb sat beside Atlas under the oak tree. The church bells were silent, but the message they carried remained. Caleb thought about how easily important stories can disappear when nobody takes the time to remember them. A simple bench, a familiar sound, a loyal dog waiting quietly. All of it had been connected from the beginning. Atlas looked toward the path one more time, then rested beside Caleb. The mystery had been answered, but the meaning was even greater than they expected. Some connections do not disappear when time passes. They simply wait for someone with enough patience and kindness to find them again. The days that followed brought a new feeling to Willow Creek. The wooden bench beneath the old oak tree was no longer just a quiet place beside the church. It had become a symbol of memories that refused to disappear. People who had walked past it for years now stopped and looked at it differently. They knew the story behind it. They understood that a simple place could hold the emotions of many lives. Caleb Rowe noticed the change every time he visited with Atlas. The German shepherd still walked toward the bench whenever the church bells rang. But now, the waiting felt different. Before, Atlas seemed to be waiting for an answer. Now, he seemed to be honoring a memory. One Sunday afternoon, the community gathered near the church after the bells finished ringing. Thomas brought out more photographs from the archives, and Clara shared more stories about Samuel and his loyal companion. Families stood together beneath the oak tree, listening to moments from the past that had almost disappeared. Caleb watched everyone carefully. He realized that the greatest discovery was not finding a forgotten person or uncovering an old secret. It was seeing how one small story could bring people closer together. Atlas sat quietly among them, surrounded by gentle voices and familiar faces. The German shepherd had become part of the community's story without ever trying to be. He had simply followed his instincts and reminded everyone that loyalty has a way of lasting. Clara spent more time near the bench during her visits to Willow Creek. She would sit there with Atlas beside her and remember the years she shared with Samuel. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she simply looked at the path ahead. Caleb understood those quiet moments. Not every memory needed words. Some feelings were carried through silence. One evening, Caleb walked with Atlas around the church grounds after everyone had gone home. The sky was painted with soft colors as the sun moved lower behind the trees. He looked at the old wooden bench and thought about how many stories might be hidden in ordinary places. A bench, a photograph, a familiar sound. These things seemed small, but they could carry the weight of an entire lifetime. Atlas stopped beside the bench and looked toward the church. Caleb smiled. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he whispered. The German shepherd looked back at him with calm eyes. Caleb knew Atlas did not understand every detail of the story. He did not know about the letters, the photographs, or the promises made years ago. But Atlas understood something deeper. He understood connection. He understood waiting. He understood that some places are special because of the love left behind there. As the evening breeze moved through the branches, the church bells rang softly in the distance. Atlas remained beside the bench, peaceful and steady. But this time, he was not waiting alone. The story that once belonged only to the past had become something shared by an entire community. And Caleb realized that sometimes a miracle is not about discovering something new. Sometimes it is about remembering something that was always there. Years later, the wooden bench beneath the old oak tree still stood beside the little white church in Willow Creek. The paint had faded a little more, and the wood carried more marks from the changing seasons. But the meaning of that place had only grown stronger. Every Sunday afternoon, when the church bells rang across the town, Atlas still walked toward the bench with the same quiet purpose. Caleb Rowe would follow beside him, smiling because he finally understood. The German shepherd was never searching for something that was missing. He was honoring something that was always there. A promise, a memory, a connection that time could not erase. The story of the bench became a part of Willow Creek. New families heard about Samuel and his loyal companion. Children who walked near the church learned why the old wooden seat beneath the oak tree mattered. People began to slow down and appreciate the small moments around them. A place that was once overlooked became a reminder that every corner of life can hold a meaningful story. Caleb often thought about the first day Atlas stopped beside the bench. At that time, he only saw a dog following a strange routine. He never imagined that a simple walk would uncover years of friendship, patience, and love. But Atlas had noticed what others missed. The German shepherd had followed a quiet feeling, and that feeling had brought people back together. One peaceful afternoon, Caleb sat beside Atlas at the bench while the church bells echoed above them. The town was calm. The trees moved gently in the breeze. The world seemed to slow down for a moment. Caleb looked at the old wooden seat and remembered everything that had happened because of it. He remembered Thomas opening the church archives. He remembered Clara returning to Willow Creek. He remembered the stories that had been waiting patiently for someone to hear them. Atlas rested beside him, his eyes peaceful and steady. Caleb placed a hand gently on the dog's back and smiled. "You were never just waiting for someone," he whispered. "You were reminding everyone to remember." The German shepherd looked toward the path one more time, just as he had done every Sunday before. But now the path was no longer empty. It carried footsteps, conversations, and memories shared by people who understood the meaning behind the waiting. As the final church bell faded into the evening sky, Caleb and Atlas slowly walked home together. Behind them, the wooden bench remained beneath the oak tree, holding the stories of those who had sat there before and those who would sit there in the future. Some stories are not found in books. Some are found in quiet places, gentle moments, and the hearts of those who never stop remembering. And sometimes, the smallest signs can lead us back to the people, promises, and memories that were never truly lost.